Hello and welcome to this afternoon's session, the Symposium on Language Comprehension. We're going to be talking today about studying human language outside the laboratory. And I wanted to start off with a picture of one of my favourite places in the whole world. This is a picture of Three Cliffs Bay, which is about 15 minutes away from Swansea University, which is where we were supposed to have been today. And I'm very, very sad not to be sharing the delights of South Wales with the EPS community this week. And I just wanted to put that there to remind us that hopefully we'll all be able to get back together in a physical meeting in the not too distant future. But on the other hand, I've really enjoyed this morning looking at all the unfamiliar names popping up on the chat. And I really hope that this online meeting has been a really good opportunity to welcome some new people into the EPS community. So thank you to everybody who has joined us today. I also just wanted to pause now and give a huge thank you both to Heather, but more especially to Sam Hearn, the EPS administrator, for the absolutely gargantuan effort of putting together today's meeting. When Sam took on this job, he couldn't possibly have known what he was going to be asked to do. So huge thank you to Sam for his efficiency and enthusiasm. So onto the symposium. I now have to remind, how do I click? I'm sorry. There we go. So today's symposium really grew out of my email inbox. Now, I'm sure I'm not alone in having a slightly out of control email inbox at the moment. But one thing I've been noticing is I've been getting an increasing number of queries from particularly junior researchers, PhD students, who've been asked to move their research online over the last few months. Now, online experiments have been something that my lab's been doing for 10 years or so now. And really, I just thought this would be a good opportunity within the EPS to help some of you learn from our mistakes. So really the symposium is of two halves. The first half, well, the first part will be kind of in some ways the boring half, which will be me talking about what we've learned about how to run good online experiments. So hopefully that will be helpful to those of you who might be doing this for the first time, but also those of you who've run a couple of online studies, but are maybe in the process of thinking about how you can fine tune and optimize your processes. Then having that as a backdrop, the idea is to then move on to inspire you about the wonderful things that can be done on online research. So we've got a buffet course of fantastic online research. And this is aiming you to encourage you not just to take your familiar paradigms and transplant them onto the online platforms, but to be really ambitious and creative in the science that we do. So I'm going to kick off with a talk about data quality, and then I will pass on to the others for some fabulous examples of what is possible. So most of us train to do our research in a room, something like this, a very cold, sanitized, clean environment where we have control over the tech, we can speak to the participant as they come in, we can sit next to them if we want, we can debrief them at the end and find out what they thought of our task. And we have complete control over everything within that environment for the time they're doing our task. When we do our experiments online, it's a whole other world. We have no idea what distractions might be in the room while our participant is doing their experiment. We have no idea what external distractions might come along partway through the experiment that they're doing for us. And we also have no idea, I'm sorry, that all came a bit at once. We also have no idea whether they might be multitasking or indeed doing our experiment in a wildly inappropriate, socially noisy environment. And believe me, this does happen. That data that you've been preparing for months, it is not unheard of to then find out that your participant was actually in the pub with their friends while doing your experiment. And of course, we don't even know who these participants are. That 23-year-old male undergraduate whose data we're looking at might indeed come from somebody entirely different. So what do? We can't control this. And in some sense, I think the key decision that you have to make is to just accept that this is the way things are. You cannot ensure that your participant is doing the experiment in the environment you want them to be. So you just have to accept this and move on and build safeguards into your experiment that take this as read. I do feel sometimes people are in denial. They think, oh, if I'm really careful about recruitment, if I'm really careful about X, Y, and Z, my participants will be doing my experiment properly and I can be sure of that. You can't. You can never be sure. So you have to build safeguards into your experiment in order to make sure your data quality is good. So I'm going to start the talk with a very brief overview of why we might be doing online experiments, and I'm going to do a slightly kind of personal research journey to deal with, to cover some of these topics. I'll then briefly overview what I see as the 3 necessary components for a good online experiment before the kind of meat of the talk, which is a framework for optimizing data quality online. So my research, as some of you may know, I've presented lots of this at EPS over the years, is on word meaning access. So if you hear the word trunk, how it is you're able to accurately decide whether somebody's talking about a part of an elephant, a part of a car, a tree, a suitcase, and so on. And we started running experiments online quite early, and this was because we had a bunch of experiments we wanted to run that could not be run in the lab. So we ran a collaboration with Radio 4, a kind of public engagement kind of exercise where we collected lots of data from people after they'd listened to a radio show. We also ran an online experiment that allowed us to specifically recruit some participants who would have been hard to get into the lab in any great numbers. We recruited some recreational rowers. So these were experiments that we were doing online because that was the only way of doing the science we wanted to do. But then there was a shift, and then there was a shift towards starting to do experiments that could perfectly well have been run in the lab, but that we were choosing to run online, partly because it allowed our data collection to become more efficient in terms of researcher time, but also that then allowed us to run better powered experiments, collect more data, gain confidence in the answers we were getting to our questions. And it was really at that point where we started running experiments that could easily have been run in the lab that we started to think about data quality. I think in the early days of online experiments, it was a bit kind of Wild West. It was just like, whoa, we're getting all this data. Isn't this amazing? 300 participants in 10 minutes. My mind is blown. And all data was good data, and we were grateful for what we were getting. But since then, we've been thinking about data quality much more carefully. Now, probably the main lesson I've learned is actually things have been much better than we thought they would be. When I started doing experiments online, I was told a rule of thumb: if you're testing online, you need twice as much data as if you're testing in the lab. And I've seen no evidence that that's remotely true. I think if you set your experiments up well, you can easily get comparable data quality online. The other thing I've learned that's really important, and in some ways this is bad news for you because it means I can't help you with your experiment, is that most of the things that are important for data quality are specific to an individual experiment. And so you have to think very carefully about your experiment. And this is kind of, experimental psych 101, that the design properties of your experiment are critical. The other good news stories is that most of the concerns that we've come up with can be addressed, that we haven't seen insurmountable problems. There have been some tricky issues along the way, but most things have been okay. So in general, there's 3 components to a successful online experiment. The first is clearly the tech. You have to get the tech of your experiment right. And I'm not going to talk about this in any great detail today. The second component is the recruitment, how you bring participants to your experiment. But then the third component, which I think is the overlooked component, is your data quality control. What it is you're doing with your data once you've got it, that allows you to be confident in your data. So starting with the tech, again, I don't want to talk very much about this. Broadly speaking, there are a number of different sources of complexity, things that become more problematic online compared to the lab. The most obvious is, of course, you're always reliant on a web connection for data transfer. But the second issue is you're always reliant on the participants' hardware and their software. So you can't control what their device is or what their browsers are. And all of these issues have implications for issues around timing, getting accurate timing both for the presentation of stimuli and for the reaction times that you're trying to measure. They also have particular consequences around audio and visual stimuli, again, both in terms of presenting audio and visual stimuli and in recording audio, which you may want to do. The good news is that for most of the commonly used bits of software out there, and most of us are using one of a handful of dominant pieces of software, that there are now very good validation studies that are easily accessible. And these validate not only how these pieces of software work in theory, but how they work in practice for real participants with an array of different browsers and hardware. So whatever tech you're using, make sure you take the time to look at those validation studies and give yourself confidence about what's available. And then, of course, remember that you have the power to restrict participants' access to your experiment on the basis of their hardware and software. So most of the platforms out there allow you to do this very straightforwardly, so excluding people on the basis of using a particular browser or a particular piece of hardware. Things really only get tricky, in my view, if you're looking at very brief presentations and if you care very, very much about millisecond timing. So once you're down into issues around refresh rates, and particularly tricky if you're interested in individual differences, because you have to be aware that your individual participants may differ in the tech they're using. So, for example, your older participants may on average be using slightly less expensive and modern tech than your younger participants, and you may have socioeconomic differences between your participants as well. So those are really the two areas where I feel you have to look really carefully at the tech. If you're with those aside, most of the off-the-shelf online testing platforms are really very, very reliable now in terms of the timing information they provide you. Please check your experiments multiple times on multiple combinations of browsers and devices. Just because it works on Chrome doesn't mean it'll work on Firefox and so on. And just because it works today on a particular browser doesn't mean it'll work tomorrow. Browsers, it's a place where you're giving up your control. Browsers make updates without consulting us before they do this. So even if your experiment runs now, it may not run in 10 minutes time. So be very, very careful about checking your tasks and about recycling old tasks. And always include some kind of open-ended question at the end. Is there anything you think I should know about how my experiment ran for you? Participants are normally extremely helpful at feeding back if something weird and unanticipated had happened, and this can save you from a whole heap of wasted data. And please, so people are still using some of the software that doesn't involve routinely giving you timing information, and this will come up in the data quality section of the talk. But I think it's virtually impossible to rely on your data quality if you're using survey software that doesn't routinely tell you how long somebody took to make a decision. There's so many platforms out there that give you this information easily. So that's a really, really brief overview of tech. I think the tech is really a good news story now, and that most of these platforms are dealing with the majority of the issues that we might have had very easily. Recruitment, again, I don't want to talk much about it. I just want to mention a brief bee in my bonnet. That for the vast majority of online experiments, we should be treating this like proper science, like proper experiments. I'm still hearing lots of stories of students saying, oh, my supervisor said I don't need to pay participants because it's online. As a rule of thumb, if you would have paid your participants in the lab, you should be paying them online. Don't expect something for nothing, and value your participants' time, and in the vast majority of cases, pay them properly. I prefer using an online participant pool such as Prolific, which deals with a lot of the issues for me. So it deals with a lot of screening. Obviously, this isn't compulsory. If you're not going to make use of a participant pool, you need to think very carefully about how you're going to screen your participants. Obviously, there are exceptions where you don't need to be paying your participants. This includes some of the really fun gamified experiments, or the experiments where you're telling somebody something. So you might be running an experiment, and at the end they get to find out how super clever they are and how amazing they are, and that kind of Facebook learn something about you model. So if people feel they're getting something from your experiment, then that's fine. I've also seen some really great successful projects where researchers have really strong existing relationships with the participant pool. So your participants already have a commitment to you. Either you've recruited them through a school or some charitable organization or some science communication, public engagement in science project and so on. But you need your participants to be engaged, either because you're paying them or for some other reason that you've set up. But engaged participants are critical to data quality. But with the best will in the world, even with the best tech and the best recruitment, one thing I haven't mentioned there is ethics. There are some really thorny issues around the ethics of participation that I think we need to take. I don't really have time to talk about today, but I just wanted to flag that up as something that we need to take more time to think of. Data quality control, though, with the best will in the world, you're going to get some crappy data, and we need to know what to do with that. So what I'm going to walk you through very briefly is a 5-stage plan. that I hope will just give you a kind of checklist of things to check before you start collecting your data. And it's really around developing appropriate exclusion criteria, developing ways of saying whose data you will exclude from your analysis. Now, to be clear, I'm talking about excluding participants from your analysis. I'm not talking about not paying them. That is a whole other thing. My attitude is very generous. If somebody's at a half decent attempt at my experiment, I pay them because I can't tell the difference between somebody who couldn't be bothered to do my experiment and somebody who's genuinely struggling for cognitive reasons. So if they've had a half decent attempt, I pay them. I then make a completely separate decision about whether to include them in my data analysis. Right, the first thing to do is a kind of brainstorming activity, ideally involving 3 or 4 people who know a bit about your task. You need to think about what your concerns are. What could be problematic running your experiment online? And in general, there are 3 different areas that we need to look at here. One is participants not being who they say they are. So, for example, if I'm running a language study, it's really important to me that if I want native speakers of British English, that's what I'm getting. I might be particularly interested in their age. For ethical reasons, I might want to be clear about age boundaries. The second area of concern is around deliberate cheating, and that's relevant only for some experiments. So, for example, if you've got a vocabulary test, could people be looking up the answers online? If there's a working memory test, could they be writing them down? So think carefully, is there any way that a participant could deliberately cheat in my task? But probably the area of concern that people spend most time thinking about is what happens if participants are not properly attending? And to some extent, this is inevitable, that they're not always going to be attending. But you need to think about what exactly is it that in your experiment you're worried about. Are you worried that they might not attend properly to the instructions, and so they might not exactly understand what they're supposed to be doing? Are you worried that their level of responding will be variable, so that they'll be attending at some points in the experiment and not others? Or are you worried about a general kind of good enough processing strategy where they're processing your task at a very superficial level? And it's important to distinguish between these different issues and how they might manifest in your particular experiment. And in the context of all these decisions, you have to consider the reward structure of your task. So what would motivate people to cheat? Well, people are likely to cheat if your experiment is very well paid and they feel they need to lie in order to get access. So that would relate both to them not being who they say they are, but potentially cheating on vocabulary tests and so on, because they don't want to get booted off the system because they're performing badly. So stage 1, you're specifying the concerns for your specific experiment. Then the second stage is to really think, what's the worst case scenario here? What's my nightmare scenario? And in some cases, if the participants are not who they say they are, if you're trying to compare monolinguals to bilinguals, you might completely destroy that contrast and your data might be totally worthless. Again, with cheating, if you can't be confident that your participants are not writing down the answers to your working memory task, then your data may be completely unusable. And again, with the attention, well, it might just make your data noisy, which you could potentially deal with. But if it's making it systematically biased, then you're in real trouble. So specify, and I do mean write down the kind of worst case scenarios here, because it's those worst case scenarios that will drive the development of appropriate exclusion criteria. You need to build things into your experiment that at the end of data collection allow you to exclude the people that are driving these problems. So I might be building in some kind of standardized speeded vocabulary test. I might be really persistent with my demographic questions to make sure I'm getting accurate data. I might be looking very carefully at reaction time patterns, looking for predictable patterns in behavior. So on a working memory task, you know which items they're going to be better at and which items they're going to be worse at. And you can exclude people who are not showing these familiar, well-established patterns. The attention, I can't go through them all. There's a whole array of things out there, tools available to us that allow us to deal with attention and highlight those participants who are not properly attending to your task, either because they're doing very badly overall or because their performance is highly variable. And this is the point where you may have to abandon your experiment. This is the point where you need to reassure yourself that you have designed experiment-specific exclusion criteria that will allow you to exclude from your data analysis people that are inappropriate, whose data should not be there. And this is why it needs to be done ahead of time, because this is the point where you know whether actually you've got a problem that you can't solve. You then pilot. I can't emphasize this enough, particularly with new tasks or new populations. You need to confirm that your exclusion criteria are sufficient, that you're getting rid of all the people whose data is crummy, that you don't want in your final data set, but also that you're not overly enthusiastically excluding people, that you're not chopping off the tail of your distribution such that your low performers on whatever your task is are being systematically excluded from your data set. And then really important to pre-register these exclusion criteria. Compared to a lab-based study, I think it's pretty much inevitable that you will be excluding more participants. With the best will in the world, with the best design in the world, there will be more people that don't meet your criteria. And if you don't pre-register your exclusion criteria, you're of course laying yourself open to accusations of cherry picking, that you've only included those participants who are giving you nice data. And so if you've got high exclusion rates, this is something that reviewers and readers of your papers are going to be deeply concerned about. So I would argue that pre-registration improves the quality of your experiments, partly because you're thinking about these exclusion criteria before you collect your data. And in my experience, if you do it then, you take the time, you do it properly. Whereas if you wait until that juicy, lovely data set is sitting in your on your machine waiting for those ANOVAs to be run, you tend to rush through that process. So I think it improves the quality of your experiments, but it also gives the reviewers and readers that trust in your results, that your data can be trusted. Many ways for pre-registering, many options in terms of how much or how little you choose to pre-register. In general, we find that early on in the development of a paradigm, we tend to not pre-register very much because we don't necessarily know what people's performance is going to look like. And then as we get more familiar with a paradigm, with a task, our pre-registrations become more tightly specified. And clearly there's a trade-off here. The more you put into your pre-registration, the more trust your readers will get that everything is being done in a systematic and transparent way. So to summarize, you specify what it is you're worried about with this experiment. You specify the worst case scenario. What's your nightmare scenario here? And you use that to develop sensible exclusion criteria that give you confidence that people who are not giving you appropriately good data can be excluded from your analysis. You pilot these and then you pre-register them. And of course, then everything is lovely. And then the data arrives. And you inevitably discover new and exciting forms of weirdness that you can't possibly have anticipated. And I think it's really important for those of you who haven't embraced the world of pre-registration to just be clear that pre-registration shouldn't feel like a straitjacket, that you may well need to deviate from your pre-registration. And that's totally fine as long as you're open and transparent about what you're doing, and that as long as what you're doing will seem sensible and appropriate to the average reader of your paper. So don't feel that your pre-registration is preventing you from making sensible decisions once your data has arrived. But transparency is key here. I've had lots of conversations with people about the extent to which you should check your data as it comes in. I would always collect data in stages, never release your entire experiment in one go. All you need is a server error and you've wasted 100 participants worth of data. But I also think it's a good idea to keep a check on data quality as it comes in. Are people taking about the right amount of time to do your experiment? Are their percent correct on your tasks about right? I wouldn't go much further than that. You don't want to be peeking at your data, but just generally, are they giving you appropriate data or something weird happening that you hadn't expected? I think that's just good financial management to keep an eye on your experiment as you're running it. And then, as I've said, always have some kind of open-ended questions at the end, because this helps you then to refine your exclusion criteria. So if somebody gives you an answer at the end saying, I was down the pub with my friends and we did all of this together as a collaborative effort, well, then you need to look at their data and say, okay, what were the warning signs in their data? Did my pre-registered exclusion criteria pick up the fact that this person was doing weird nonsense, or were there warning signals that my criteria missed? So it's very helpful for refining your exclusion criteria. Final slide. I think I'm on time. Actually, none of this is specific to online experiments. This is all stuff that we should be doing when we're in the lab. I think we sometimes have a glorified view of what goes on in the in the sanctity of the experimental psychology lab. You know, we don't always watch our participants. They might be looking at cat pictures on their phones. We don't really know. This is all stuff we should be doing. And then also just to remind you that all of this stuff is there partly to persuade yourself that your data is reliable, but also reviewers, editors, and your peers who are reading your papers. And in my experience, getting experiments published from online experiments has been relatively trouble-free. I'd anticipated more trouble, but I do think the pre-registration really helps you. It protects you from reviewers saying, why have you excluded quite a high proportion of your participants? That's all I have to say. I've put Becky's picture up here, but actually this is a huge oversight of mine. There should be at least three pictures on here. Becky had a huge contribution to this work. She used to be a postdoc in my lab, but also two past PhD students of mine should most definitely be up here. Ava Poort really led the way on the pre-registration work, and Rachel Hume did some great work on data quality, particularly for tricky experiments like multi-session experiments where we can really have trouble making sure that things stay on track. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to jump in now. My name's Carol McGettigan. I'm the next speaker, and I'm going to just look at some of the questions that have been posted for Jenny already. So we've already had a couple of questions during the talk, but if you have more, please do post them now. So the first question is about the notion of individual differences that you mentioned, and one questioner asks, Joe Butler asks, do you think you can improve on this, for example, by doing something, within subjects, having a within subjects design? So maybe you want to comment on your experience of using within versus between subjects designs, perhaps?
It's a great question. So I would always try and use it within participants' design wherever possible. And the vast majority of the studies I've run to date have been within participant to a large extent. So it's only really when you start becoming interested in the individual differences that things become tricky. If I want to compare older participants to younger participants, and I know that there may well be systematic differences in their tech, then clearly I just need to take that into account, and I need to think carefully about what differences might there be. How can I make sure I've recorded that, and how can I make sure my analysis takes into account any boring tech-based explanations for the data. So, for example, some devices and some browsers, you can get a slightly longer delay. So the reaction time that you're seeing might actually be a slight underestimate. And if that's happening systematically more for older or younger participants, you can be in trouble. So I think it's, again, it's things you need to think about in the design stage.
And we have another question from Frauke. So when you were commenting on the different types of data that you might collect online, she asks, you mentioned questionnaires, reaction time experiments, choice experiments, eye tracking. Do you think that your general recommendations, are there any kind of differences in what you would recommend for different types of task in your experience?
That's tricky. I mean, eye tracking is really only just getting going. There were a couple of some of you may have been on the Be Online conference a couple of days ago, and there was those talks were available, and there were some really excellent talks there specifically about eye tracking. I think it's really hard to give a general answer to that. I think I'm just going to come back to the point that I made before, that everything's about the specific experiment, and particularly about the inferences you want to draw. So to what extent do different data quality issues potentially undermine the conclusion you want to draw in the discussion of your paper? And it's experimental design 101. What do I want to be able to conclude, and how do these design decisions potentially interfere with those inferences? So I don't think it's necessarily a question that different tasks have categorically different issues. I think it's that different things matter depending on the kinds of inferences and the kinds of statistics that you want to be running.
Mm-hmm. And there are many other questions, so hopefully you'll get a chance to look at these at another point. But There was one about multi-session studies, and I think if you mentioned that, I think that, that would be an interesting thing to comment on if you have any experience of running those. Someone asks about, what would your worst case scenarios be for that?
Well, your worst case scenario is clearly they all turn up, you pay them to do session one, and then they never come back. Now, Rachel Hume, who's now at Aston, did some beautiful multi-session experiments. And again, I keep telling you, there was some great talks on Be Online a couple of days ago on this. It's partly about, so we tend to recruit from Prolific, and our experience of Prolific participants is they're extremely motivated and they do what you ask them to do, and the return rate is pretty high. With multi-session experiments, the spanner in the works comes along where you want them to return at a very particular time. And with the best will in the world, people don't know what they're doing in a week's time at a particular time of day. So it is tricky, and it needs a lot of really careful hands-on management. So it's not a case with these multi-session experiments that you click go and you come back and your data is in. Rachel was having to kind of handhold these participants, send lots of individual emails, really kind of nurse them through the process and really value their time and make sure they were coming back and check in with them a day before so that they knew exactly when they were going to get sent the link at the right time. So it is quite time intensive. It's still less intensive than running it in the lab. It just takes a lot of care, and do it in, again, the message to do it in small groups. Run a couple of participants, see what works, what doesn't work. Their data becomes increasingly valuable over time, so you just don't want to take any risks. So it is possible. I think Rachel was looking at dropout rates of around 20 to 30%, depending on the tasks and on the duration.
Yeah, and I think that goes nicely back to your comment about the difference between testing online and in lab. There are many things that we had to take into consideration, all those emails and meeting people at reception and chatting to them on the phone about, where to find the building and all that. We Absolutely. Should expect that we can't rid ourselves of all of that if we're going to go online. Absolutely. I think we've come to the end of your slot. So there are more questions though in the feed. So
I will pop on there and do some chatting.
Yeah, so I'm now going to take over, I guess. So
yes, we're going to swap hats.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm now taking off my speaker hat and putting on my chair hat, and it is my very, very great pleasure to introduce somebody who you've just seen. Professor Carolyn McGettigan is Chair of Speech and Hearing Sciences at UCL. Her research program is currently funded by the Leverhulme Trust, and she's going to talk to us about projects to do with studying voice perception using online experiments, and I'm super, super excited to hear about this. Thank you, Carolyn.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I should give credit from the start to Nadine Levan, who wrote basically all of this talk in a slightly different version that she presented at the Be Online conference earlier this week. And this work speaks not only to the things that she's been doing in the lab over the recent years, but also my other PhD students and postdocs. So thank you to all of them, because they're the ones who run the experiments, and I'm the one who has the pleasure of seeing all this lovely data come through. So just to give you a bit of context, what we work on in the lab is currently funded by the Leverhulme Trust, and it's a large project looking at aspects of voice identity processing. So how do we get identity information from other people in all sorts of ways, and also how do we express our own identity when we do what I'm doing now, which is speaking to other people. So today's talk is going to talk about online data that we've collected in relation to this research strand A that you can see on the screen. So it's really about the perceptual end of things. And I look forward to hopefully looking at speech production actually in the coming months and years. Okay, so the general question is, what kind of information about a person can listeners get from a voice? And the kinds of questions that we address with our experiments that we run in the lab and online are, how do we work out the identity of someone else? How do we discriminate between different talkers? How do we recognize an identity that we have learned in the lab or that we know from our everyday lives? And we use a lot of different stimuli for that. So we use what you might call ambient recordings. So, clips of people speaking in a television show or interview clips from YouTube, that kind of thing. We also use lab recordings of participants, and we may or may not add acoustic manipulations depending on our research question. And then we're also interested in other aspects of what you can do if you're not trying to identify a person, but rather trying to get some information about what they may be like. For example, evaluating traits of personality. So we do this in explicit ways by asking people to listen to voices and rate them on a scale, for example, for trustworthiness. But we also try and look at other types of ways in which people might learn about other people via the voice in the context of, for example, an economic decision-making game, some sort of conditioning, some sort of reinforcement learning. So that's kind of the broad picture of what we do. So we might also be interested in listener characteristics too. So when we're recruiting our participants, we might want to find people that fit a certain brief in order for us to test our research question. So if we're looking at situations where we want to identify people who are familiar with a set of voices and people who are not, then we have in the past gone out and searched in a targeted way for people who have or who have not seen a certain television show, and then used excerpts from that show in order to test voice identity perception. And of course, we can change the status of a listener during a task, so we can train people to recognize certain voices and then see how that affects their later test performance with those voices. So I'm going to talk about one example to start with, which was kind of our gateway to online testing. And then I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing more recently, which has been using a lot the experimental building platform Gorilla. So I'm going to start with an example where we actually found our participants on Twitter and we tested them using the Qualtrics survey software. And then I'll move on to talk about some experiments with Prolific and Gorilla. So, just thinking about looking at Jenny's talk and thinking like, what was it that brought me to online testing in the first place? It wasn't actually the current crisis. It was that I was at the time working on a campus university where in the summer it wasn't impossible, but it was a lot more difficult to get participants to come into the lab and do experiments. So we were really of students in big chunks of the year. So that was the broad motivation, but also for a particular study we wanted to run, we were in this situation where we wanted to identify people who had familiarity with a certain TV show. And so that was our gateway, and I'll tell you about that study first. So if I move on. So we started with a task where we wanted people to identify voices or do an identification task, which involved sorting sounds into different piles according to the voice identity that was perceived. So, all the people from this talker, put them in a pile together or a cluster. All the people from another talker, drag and drop those clips into the same pile. And I will not take credit for the ingenuity of actually having done this using a PowerPoint slide as the task. This was actually the idea of Nadine Lavana and Lucia Garrido, who were working together at Brunel University on a similar task. But we wanted to do a version of this task when I was at Royal Holloway. And what we had, quite simply, was a PowerPoint slide with these icons on it with sound clips behind them, and people could click on the clips, listen to them, and then just drag the things together on the screen. So all we needed was people to be able to download a PowerPoint slide and put it back up into the internet. So we went to Qualtrics, and actually Qualtrics survey software, though it's not set up for delivering stimuli and collecting reaction times and so on and so forth, it's actually pretty good if you need someone to download a file, do something with it and put it up again. So that's what we used to test people, and it was actually just fine and worked very well and gave us good quality data that were published. But where we found our participants was Twitter. We put many, many calls out on Twitter going, have you seen the TV show Breaking Bad? If so, we need you for our study. And then similarly, we found control participants who had not. So I guess the message about this is you don't need to think that this has got to be something super sophisticated the way that you would always run an experimental psychology study in the lab. There may be ways to get data online that are actually quite straightforward and no impediment to getting a good quality study. However, of course, then in later work, we realized that there were some amazing experiment building platforms available that we could use to run the kinds of studies we would typically run in the lab, collecting button presses, getting reaction times, and so on and so forth. So thinking back to the sort of questions that I have across the studies we run in the lab, we generally have a task where somebody listens to something and or looks at something and then gives us a response. So they might hear something and be asked who was speaking. Maybe these were voices they learned in the lab and they give us a button click to say who it is. Or they might hear two clips and be asked to say whether that's the same person or two different people. Maybe one of the clips is a video of a face and they're asked to match the face to the voice. And then if we're looking at these kind of more sort of scaled impressions that people get of voices, we might ask them to make a judgment about, for example, trustworthiness and give a response on a sliding scale. We've done more involved types of experiments where you might hear a clip of a voice and then you're invited to invest some currency units in that voice. And then you find out something about whether that voice is going to give you a return on your investment. And we do that iteratively within a task. So there's lots of different things that we can do, and these are all readily implementable in something like Gorilla. Now, at this point, I think it's probably important for me to say that what I don't do in my experiments is I don't test at the threshold of auditory perception. These are not psychophysical experiments where I'm interested in testing, for example, people's, just noticeable differences for pitch or certain formant frequencies or something like that. That kind of thing I have not tried, but I anticipate that these are the kinds of studies that will face bigger challenges if you try and do them online. What I'm interested in is if someone can hear a voice and understand what it says, then we're good enough for them to go ahead into my study. Okay, so what do our studies generally look like? So generally all our studies are under 30 minutes from start to finish, and ideally less than 20 minutes. And so now I'm sort of going to go into some of the overview of the experience that we've had running studies rather than telling you about specific results. And some of this I think will probably overlap with the kinds of things that Jenny said. Try not to make any individual task longer than 15 minutes. If it has to be longer, break it up into blocks, let the participants have a little break in between. We really want to try and counteract any notion that they might just get super fatigued in the middle of this. And we usually recruit our participants via Prolific, and as Jenny mentioned, you can do lots of screening on there, for example, for self-reported normal hearing, first language, maybe actual physical location, that kind of stuff that might be relevant. So at the moment I have a student who needs people who are familiar with Northern Irish accents like mine for their study, and so we're coming up with strategies about how we do that, maybe by asking for people who live in that area. People are always paid at rate of $7.50 per hour, and I will echo Jenny's comments. Pay people if you possibly can, because you cannot know whether indeed they just had a really messy time trying to get this experiment to work, and it's not really their fault. So err on the side of payment if you have that opportunity. So let's just talk through an example study. So again, this is kind of like a template study that we would run that may or may not contain these previous kind of task structures that I told you, or trial structures. An example study will start with an audio check. We are invariably playing people's voices, and if they can't hear them, we're in trouble. Then we have our task, and then we have some sort of debrief section of the experiment. So how do we check whether people can hear things? Now this, as you may hear again, will really depend on the experiment you're running. First and foremost, people need to be able to hear something coming out of their computer. So can people hear stuff? And another tip is, if you need it and you want smooth transition from trial to trial, you may want to make sure that autoplay is functional on that participant's web browser. So that's a consideration. So I'm just going to give you a little bit on that. So can people hear the sounds? So this is something from Gorilla Open Materials created by Emma Janes in New York. This is a very simple little slide screen in Gorilla. The participant has the opportunity to click play and listen to a spoken word. They type the word into the screen. They click to proceed. If the word is correct, we knew they heard it. Very, very simple, rudimentary check. They can adjust the volume and play and replay until it's comfortable for them. A tip for this, of course, is if you're going to then play sounds later on, make sure that those sounds and the test sound have been normed so that the volume that they set now is appropriate for that test sound is going to work for the sounds that come later on. So that's quite a straightforward way of doing it. However, you might want to be a little more careful and make more close checks on their listening approach. So, as I am doing now, given the talks, I'm just so used to it, just wearing headphones so that they're listening in a more close way. We can't always guarantee that, of course. I can listen to headphones in an extremely noisy environment, but I guess it does speak to at least some level of preparation on their part. So there is a downloadable task. I think is now also available on Gorilla Open Materials, but it's written up in this paper. This is a headphone check. Quite simply, it is able to roughly detect the difference between a person who's trying to listen to the sounds coming out of their laptop in the speakers versus someone who is wearing headphones. So the task is very simple. They listen to 3 tones. They have to tell you which of the 3 tones are the quietest, and there are 6 trials. So you can then decide on a threshold for progression to your satisfaction. But essentially, it's doing clever things with playing the left and the right-hand channel of the headphones, either in phase or out of phase. And depending on whether you're wearing headphones or not, that will give you a different percept of the loudness of that sound. So that's a way of basically a quick catch as to whether people are wearing headphones or not. Now, autoplay. So imagine we're going through a task where someone has to listen to, 90 clips of voices and give me a rating of trustworthiness in each one. It would be a little bit cumbersome, although not entirely problematic, if they had to actively click every time for the next sound. So what you can do is enable autoplay in their web browser such that as soon as the screen loads, the sound plays and then they get the response option. So what you can do there, and this came up in the questions, actually, you can find out through Prolific or through screening, or just asking your participants what browser are you using. And so if you ask them to tell you what browser you're using and they click on a button, we can take them to a page where we then give them instructions about how to enable autoplay on their browser. So just to sort of clarify what that means, if you recall that it used to be that when you scroll through Facebook, if there was a video there, it would just come on and the sound would come on whether you touched it or not. This has now been disabled on a lot of web browsers to stop irritating people, but actually for the purposes of experiments, you might actually want this to happen, that the sounds play straight away. So that's what I'm talking about. So then you can take the participant through, they see a screen where they see something particular to the browser they're using, they can follow the steps. When they're ready, they proceed. We give them a second screen that has an autoplay presentation of sounds in it. If they're not hearing something, then it seems to maybe not have worked, and they can contact us then via Prolific, for example, to have a chat about why it might not be working and see if we can fix it. So that's an option. And also just to note that these ways in which browsers allow you to put autoplay on and off do vary, and they change over time. So make sure your stuff is up to date before you put your experiment up. So let's now talk about the task. So people perhaps listening to pairs of sounds and making a same different judgment. Just a few general points on this. We obviously want to aim to collect good quality data, try and give clear instructions, include vigilance checks, and I'll say a little bit about those. Try and keep boredom at a minimum for your participants. So what do we mean by clear instructions? Try and avoid jargon. Of course, most of us are used to testing undergraduate participants in the lab, and they are not confused by the word stimuli, for example, but your average participant online may think that sounds like a bit of a weird thing. Just say sounds. Less is more. Make the text not too dense. Make sure that they're getting the key messages and be clear, because although they can come back out into Prolific and ask you questions, they probably don't want to do so. They want to plow ahead and get their money at the end. These vigilance checks, the choice of vigilance checks depends on the experiment. If you want to make sure that people are attending in a very specific way to a specific aspect of the task, then you'll need to design your vigilance checks to meet that check that you need to make. For us, and in my experience from what we've done, we try to keep it easy so that it's not a mystery to them how to complete the vigilance trial. Otherwise, they might just miss it or not understand it, and then you throw them out for no good reason. They're actually a good subject. And we try and keep it integrated with the ongoing task. So imagine you're doing this task where you're listening to a voice clip over and over, or you're listening to different clips and you're giving judgments on traits. You might encounter a new trial, and instead of hearing the voice clips you've been listening to, you hear a synthesized voice saying, please press 7 now. And then they know that they should just follow the instruction and click 7. And then we can see whether or not their response matches to what they should have heard. Also, in these kinds of voice sorting studies, with like the PowerPoint slide with moving things around, we tend to include a couple of sounds in there that are just identical sounds of a very distinctive other voice. So for example, we've used Homer Simpson. So if they don't put the two clips of Homer Simpson together in an independent pile, they haven't been paying attention to how they're supposed to do the task. Okay, so that was a rudimentary thing we included there that allowed us to check whether people were cheating, if you like. And of course, that's important for us because if your participants become quite seasoned, they may well know that, oh, I have to check the volume at the start and do that headphone check, but then actually my headphones are uncomfortable, so I'll just do the rest without them. So obviously this is a good reason to keep people engaged with listening if you need it. Keep boredom as a minimum, try and keep things engaging. We've used progress bars in Gorilla to see, so they can see how far through the experiment they are. That won't suit everybody, but it's an idea. Now, actually, we don't do very much between subjects with our auditory, within subjects with our auditory experiments, we have tended to emphasize doing things with larger groups of participants on individual conditions of the experiment and hoping that we can kind of deal with the noise that way. So, that's just a good example. Between me and Jenny, we've had different approaches coming from different perspectives. So now just finally the debrief. So of course, you might get started, do the headphone check, everything's great, subject goes in, starts doing the task, but it may well be that in the middle of the task, they encounter some technical issues. Maybe the sounds skip on a few trials, maybe something is wrong with the timing, they're not sure. If you ask them if there are any issues, you may get some extra insights. Find out what they made of the task. This has been invaluable. I mean, we've been doing some tasks where we manipulate various things and we are interested in knowing whether or not subjects are sensitive to those manipulations. They can give you a lot of information that can help you make some decisions about, whether or not you need to adjust this task and start again and so on. And also data quality checks. So thinking about data exclusion, let's say, for example, I put myself up for a study and I say, sure, I've seen Breaking Bad. Personally, I've not seen Breaking Bad, but I know the voices of Hank and Walt so well by now because I've listened to these stimuli so many times. But let's say I put myself in because I want to do a study and I had to pretend that I know Breaking Bad. Well, how do I catch those people out? Well, you can just ask them actually at the very start, at the very end of the experiment, have you really seen it? You can still do the task and we'll still pay you, but have you really seen it? It would really help our science if you would give us an honest answer. And it happens occasionally. They'll say, yeah, actually, I did see like one season, even though I said I hadn't seen it, or actually, I haven't seen this, even though I said I had. And that's okay. It would be better to get an honest answer than to have unusable data sets in there that you didn't realize. And before you test, I'm sure you hear this many times, pilot your task. Pilot it on yourself, see if it runs okay in your computer, contact people in the lab, ask them to have a run through it. We now have a sort of system where everybody in the lab will get everybody else to pilot their tasks. So we give feedback on different bits and pieces. Top tip, pilot a small batch of people on Prolific, maybe 5, 10, 20 max to get started with. If something goes badly wrong, you'll be glad that you didn't release it to 250 people at once. That's just going to save you a lot of headache and also actually save your participants a lot of grief as well, trying to kind of navigate because something went wrong in your task. So conclusions, if you run auditory studies online, then make sure your task is as easy to understand and as engaging and short as possible. Really think about trying to get high quality data out of really focused participants and what you think the limits of that might be. And you know what, sometimes we do experiments for each other in the lab and we say, oh, it felt really long. And I think, well, I really care about this. If I think it's too long, then a participant may well be lost much earlier. Build in checks that let you monitor data quality, pilot. And then, you get to a point where it's just amazing. People say, oh, I ran the new experiment last week on Thursday afternoon. And that's just an incredible thing. It's been transformative for us in the way that we've been able to do our research. And probably if I do have the opportunity, then I think I would echo Jenny's sentiments about pre-registration. So we kind of got involved in pre-register in our studies at the same time as we started to run studies online. And many of the ways that you have to think about running your studies online dovetail perfectly with the way you should be thinking about your studies anyway, and when you prepare to pre-register them. So, just a word to say, I've found that the two things together to have sort of become our lab approach, and it's been a good experience. So just to thank everyone in my lab who does all this work. As I said, I actually haven't run a study before on Prolific, so I'm quite nervous about how do I talk to participants. But it's been a great experience. And also, if the slides are available later, then I've included the studies that we've pre-printed or published using online data collection, so you can get a flavor for the different things that we've done, the vigilance checks, the different types of tasks. That's all from me. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Carolyn. A whole bunch of questions. One straightforward question. You talked about tasks being too long. Do you have any sense on an optimal length, or does that depend on the paradigm?
I think it will depend on the paradigm, and it's really rather informal. I think just trying to keep it sub half an hour is what we've tried to do no matter what. I wouldn't go super short unless that is really, you just want a one-shot rating of a voice, and we've done that kind of thing before. But I think it's just about, well, when someone's made the effort to come and visit you in the lab and come and sit in a room, maybe they're tolerant of having to sit there for an hour and they know they get 750 at the end. But if you're just grabbing someone's time in the course of a day and, you put them through an hour of this, I think the chances are they'll get fatigued more quickly. But I think there's not a hard and fast rule, no.
There's been some discussion on the chat around comparing lab data to online data, and I wondered if you had any experience of running direct comparisons where you have tasks that you've validated in the lab before putting them online.
We've not done anything formally. I hope I'm not making a mistake here, but we haven't formally compared in lab versus online data collection. In saying that, when we run studies where we have a pretty good idea, for example, how long does it take and what kind of level of accuracy might somebody reach for like learning off some voice identities at the start of a task or so on, we've seen a lot of cross-experiment consistency in that. So, that's an indication, I suppose, even with online studies that we're tapping into something relatively consistent. There was a great talk by Kyle Jasmine from Birkbeck at Be Online the other day, who's actually looked at perceptual studies comparing people who were tested online with people who were tested in the lab, doing something where there was a kind of dimensional variation in a quality of acoustic stimuli and looking at the response functions. And I mean, it was quite impressive to see that he'd got virtually perfect overlap between the online curves and the in-lab curves. So I actually think there's a lot of things that are surprisingly good about the quality of online data, even for quite close listening perceptual studies.
And obviously it's not an option right now, but some people are talking about whether your piloting should always be done in the lab so that you get that chance to properly debrief somebody and really get a sense of how they're responding to your task. Is that something you do, or are you happy for the majority of your piloting to all be done online?
We do all our piloting online, and I would say that the thing that we spend most time on is the in-lab pilot. So we all obviously go on the browser, we run through the study, and we try and give each other feedback. It's an option, of course, because why not bring someone into the lab and run the task on Gorilla? That is, perfectly doable. I've just reminded myself that we did have an MSc student who did tasks in the lab with Gorilla, and I can't recall that there were any dramatic differences between her work, her findings in terms of voice discrimination and things that we would find with online tests. So jog my memory.
So we keep talking about Be Online. There was a bit of a heated discussion there around the difference between using recruitment platforms, which tends to be my preferred approach, versus the kind of more informal recruitment strategies you've talked about using Twitter and so on. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit around the data quality issues around a kind of free-for-all type recruitment strategy where you're not gatekeeping your participants at all, and what extra issues that brings, or whether actually it's fine and I should be less cautious.
Again, like this is all good food for thought, because I think that we have the opportunity to formally compare some of the things we've done in lab with online, and where we've recruited people from, for example, Prolific versus Twitter. So actually these voice sorting tasks we've done using both platforms for recruitment, and again, don't think there's anything dramatic there. They're very comparable. To be honest, the one thing that can be a big proportional exclusion for us is this headphone check. So we find on average around 20% of participants may end up being not able to complete the task because they are deemed to not be wearing headphones. And occasionally they say, but I am wearing headphones. And that's the nature of the task, that with some particular setups, it's just not working optimally, potentially, or they are indeed wearing headphones, but they're in a really noisy room or something like that. So aside from that, which we do on Prolific, I would say that the proportion of people we actually exclude because they didn't do the task properly is something like less than 5%, and even smaller than that then because they had technical issues like the sounds didn't play or something like that. So in the end, that doesn't seem like a very poor overview. So I don't necessarily think when we look to Prolific, what I hear from colleagues in the lab is most often people are responsive. They will write if they have any comments. They tend to write like little emails saying, I just noticed in the study this and that, or, thank you, I really enjoyed this study, and that kind of stuff. And so, I've met my fair few pretty unmoved in-person participants who just come in, they don't say a word, they do the experiment, they leave. I'll confess to you, I once ran an entire MRI study where people were supposed to be listening to sounds, and the participant in the scanner said, yeah, I can hear them fine. You can hear this? Okay, great, that's great. Could you understand the sentence? Oh yeah, great. And he came out of the scanner and I paid him, and I realized that the amplifier wasn't on the whole time because he just decided, you know what, I know what happens when I say I can't hear the sounds, it delays things and I can't get to my next appointment. So I think, it's another one of those anecdotal reports of, I think we shouldn't suspect that there are people trying to dupe us online. I think the prolific participants as well, you can pick, you can actually pre-screen for participants who have a 90% rating or above. This is something we tend to do. And actually these are people who, this is a useful source of income for people on the side, and why would you jeopardize it by trying to mess experimenters around? So I think if you put reasonable vigilance checks in and you get that feedback from them, and if you really want an honesty check, take it on the chin and put an honesty check in. Did you really try and do this differently from what I said? And see what happens. But I think actually we do a lot better than we fear.
Well, I think that's a beautifully optimistic note on which to end the first half of this session. So I think we all get a brief break in which we all pretend to go and stand in a queue and get some slightly overstewed tea. And we will see you all again in 15 minutes for the second part of this symposium. Just want to thank Carolyn once more for a really stimulating talk. Thank you, Carolyn.